Hello everyone, I'm Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Today in this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about health equity and white supremacy. In this lecture, we'll cover the Lang and colleagues readings titled White Supremacy and the Core Functions of Public Health, which is in week 3. All right, so let's start out with one of the basic concepts that the Lang reading defines right from the start, and that is structural racism. So Lang and colleagues define structural racism as policies and practices in a constellation of institutions that confer advantages on people considered white and ideologies that maintain and defend these advantages while simultaneously oppressing other racialized groups. So this definition can seem really intimidating, I think. At first, it's a lot to keep in your head, and you might think, oh, wow, what does this really mean? So let's try to break this down a little bit. So structural racism can include official laws and policies, such as, say, the Indian Act, for instance, and residential schools. These were things officially enacted by the government. Of course, residential schools no longer exist in Canada, but the Indian Act still exists. It's still a law of the land. And so structural racism can be things that are officially enacted and sort of officially part of society, part of the legal or political system. But they can also involve widespread conditions or practices that aren't really sort of acknowledged in any kind of official way. They're just sort of there, but maybe, people don't talk about them or don't like to talk about them so much. And anti-Indigenous discrimination in healthcare would be an example of that kind of thing. It's sort of a de facto, it's there, as opposed to de jure, which is sort of like officially implemented in law. So structural racism can include both of those types of things, and oftentimes will include both of those types of things. Now, structural racism is typically contrasted with individual racism. Individual racism is an act of motivated by racial prejudice, such as calling someone a racial slur or something like that. And structural racism is really different than that. Individual racism is easy to grasp and understand and to spot when it happens. Structural racism is more subtle. And so one distinctive feature of structural racism is that it may lack a clear culprit or racist intent. So for example, imagine a waste management company wants to build a new garbage dump, a new waste disposal facility, and they need to find a place to put it. And their motivation is to find a place to put it that's cheapest and will involve the least political opposition. Now, it might turn out that the place that's the cheapest and where it can be built with the least political opposition is next to, say, a African American community. Imagine this is in the United States. In this case, the waste management company isn't acting with racist intent, and yet what they're doing is involving structural racism. Because this group is politically marginalized and poorer, it means that it's cheaper and more politically easier to build the waste disposal facility near their neighborhood rather than, say, next to a wealthier white neighborhood. In addition, structural racism can involve failure to act. So failure to take action against things like, for instance, abuse in the residential schools, which were known about for decades and decades, but were really mainly covered up rather than acted upon. In addition, structural racism can shape actions that reinforce racial inequalities. If you think of the example of the waste disposal facility, building that next to the African American neighborhood further impoverishes that neighborhood, which was already poorer than, say, the white neighborhoods. And so after the thing is built, the racial inequalities that caused it to be built there are even worse than they were before. Okay, so white supremacy then. So one of the things you might have wondered is what exactly is the connection between white supremacy and structural racism? And we'll get into that because that's a little bit complex. So first of all, the definition of white supremacy from the Lang and colleagues readings goes like this. They say, the glossary of conditions, practices, and ideologies that underscore the hegemony of whiteness and white political, social, cultural, and economic domination. Now, again, you might read this definition and feel like, oh, your head's exploding. What the heck does this mean? What's a concrete example of this? So we'll try to pin that down, and I'll say more about what it means in the next few slides. First, I wanted to look at the idea of hegemony, which comes up in this. And hegemony is a term that it was sort of popularized in political philosophy by a Italian Marxist philosopher named Antonio Gramsci. And the idea here is that to maintain a social hierarchy, an unjust social hierarchy, where some people have a lot more than other people, it's usually not possible to do that entirely on the basis of coercion, on force, on making people obey. It's often necessary for people to actually consent to some extent to this hierarchy. And this is one of the things that Gramsci wondered about. How is it that the ruling powers can get people who they subjugate and who they dominate to actually, in many cases, believe that the system that they live in is just and okay, or at least that it's not something they should rebel against. And the idea that Gramsci had is that this consent depends on convincing people that the hierarchy in which they live is sort of natural and the only real possibility and just the way things are. And it's not something that could ever really be questioned. It's just sort of obvious, and that's just how it is. And that's the idea of hegemony, and this idea that there's a sort of the idea that sort of white domination or white ways of thinking are sort of the only way is sort of an idea that's involved in white supremacy, this notion. And so if you think, how does white supremacy relate to structural racism? Is it the same thing? Is it a different thing? If it's different, how is it different? Well, clearly they're similar in that both are emphasizing political and economic conditions that are behind racial inequalities. And they're not really focused so much on individual acts of racial prejudice. So they're focused on these bigger social conditions. And so they're similar in that way. But they're different, in my view, because white supremacy is more focused on the ideology that helps maintain those inequalities, those structural injustices. And that's sort of this idea connects back to this idea of hegemony. And so we'll look at that a little bit more in the next two slides. Okay, so this ideology of white supremacy, what is this about? So first of all, it's important to understand that when white supremacy is being used in this context, it's referring not simply to, as this term is often used in popular sort of discourse, to refer to sort of hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazi groups and things like that. So here, white supremacy is being used in a different kind of sense than that. It's being used to refer to something more broad. And the earliest use of white supremacy in this way, to refer to this sort of broader political system or ideology associated with sort of white domination, the earliest use of this term that I know of is from the philosopher Charles Mills, who's pictured here on the lower left. And Charles Mills was a Jamaican-American philosopher born in Jamaica, got his PhD at the University of Toronto, and then spent most of his professional career at Northwestern University in Illinois in the United States. And so Mills proposed that political and ideological systems that involved whites dominating other groups should be viewed as a kind of category of themselves. In the same way you might think of patriarchy, for example. You can think of white supremacy as sort of analogous. It's a kind of social political system that involves sort of the domination and advantage of one group over other groups, in the same way that patriarchy involves the advantage of men over women. And so the question that Mills was interested in is sort of, what is this ideology? What makes this thing tick? What's its sort of underlying idea? And the conclusion that Mills came to about this was that white supremacy has this peculiar ideology that involves a kind of doublethink. It involves these sort of two narratives, an official one and a sort of hidden one. And the official one is the story of equality of all persons, doesn't ever mention race, and a story when where the society is based on freedom and so on, and everyone is equal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Mills spent a lot of time criticizing philosophers like John Rawls, who we learned about also in this week, for painting these sort of ideal pictures of a just society. And that would be sort of like, really elaborating in great depth and detail this official picture of what society was like, of what, the United States was like, or was almost like, according to this official story. And the land of immigrants, were the home of the free, all this kind of stuff. At the same time, there was the reality of just massive structural racism. And that too had a kind of an ideology of its own, and that was that, well, there should be equality among whites, but non-whites should be kept at a subordinate level. And that was always there, and that was always embedded in institutions, but it wasn't really allowed to be part of the official story. And so if you look at this diagram over here, this part on the top is supposed to be representing the official sort of story of everybody's equal, and then the bottom one is supposed to be representing this Herrenvolk. Herrenvolk, by the way, is a German word that means master race. So this is supposed to be representing this Herrenvolk aspect of white supremacy, where the whites are dominant and the non-whites are subordinate. And so a key feature of this ideology is this sort of official pronouncements of colorblind equality combined with aggressive ignorance of structural racism, not wanting to know about it, wanting to just suppress discussions of this, wanting to dismiss them as sort of, radical left-wing stuff that we shouldn't bother listening to, or maybe things that are just offensive to even bring up. And that, I think, understanding of this of the ideology of white supremacy is really important to grasp what's going on when Lang and Al get to discussing what all this would mean for public health. And this is one of the reasons I like this paper, because it's very concrete. Well, what would it mean to take white supremacy and think about that in relation to public health in concrete terms? So they approach this by thinking of three fundamental aspects of or activities of public health: assessment, policy development, and assurance. Assessment is basically like monitoring public health, like health statistics, factors that can influence health and resources to address public health issues. So this is a sort of monitoring kind of stuff, obviously a key feature of public health. And Lang and Al suggest that just as public health should, for example, keep careful observations of, say, measles outbreaks or vaccination rates or rates of diabetes and rates of obesity and things like that. In the same way, it should monitor racism, both individual and structural, because these are factors that influence health. It's obvious that racism impacts health in extremely negative ways. And so just as, measles outbreaks, racism is something that should be monitored from a public health perspective. If we look at the second major activity of public health, policy development, of communicating effectively with the public and with policymakers about public health, and creating and developing and trying to implement policies that can advance public health. Here again, Lang et al. Suggests that public health can do a better job of educating the public and policymakers about structural racism, making sure people understand the difference between structural racism and individual racism, and that public health practitioners can spend time trying to think about how could we develop policies to combat it. Notice that this is linked to the first one, and if you don't have any data about racism, it's difficult to make policies that would combat racism if you don't know what's going on about that. So you see these two things as linked. Finally, assurance is sort of like maintaining and improving public health systems. The idea is that, at any point in time, there's already a large, body of public health expertise and infrastructure and so on that exists, and you want to maintain that and improve that over time. Here, Lang call for better education on structural racism and white supremacy for the public health workforce, and that's sort of their main proposal in this area. The idea is that maintaining and improving public health involves training continually new public health workers who will enter the public health workforce. And their idea is that education on these issues are sort of key for creating a public health system that's going to be more effectively able to address issues of racism and racial inequality. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.